Elisabeth is essentially, she is the global center for the responsibility to protect in Geneva. She does amazing work there with the members of the Human Rights Council. So maybe that's something that you can ask her about as well. But of course, today she's here to talk about something which she has a lot of expertise in as well, which is the situation in Venezuela. And I think it's going to be very interesting because Elisabeth, actually, it's the only case that we're going to touch on in Latin America for this whole week. Also earlier today, we talked about some regional organizations, so the EU, ASEAN, and the AU, but we didn't talk about the OAS. So perhaps there's something that you want to comment on about that, or we can ask you questions about it later. But I think over to you, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karen, and hi, everyone. Apologies again. Thank you for having me, and Karen, thanks for this really kind introduction, and it's such an honor to be here with you today for this session. I also want to thank Martin, who I understand is probably not here, but for the record, I really want to thank him for the invitation and for having me. I also have to say I looked at your at the outline of the entire course, and I'm quite jealous that I don't get to be in the other lectures because it's a fantastic program. So it's wonderful for me to be here and to meet you all. I also want to make this as interesting as possible for all of you. I know that it's 2 p.m. and the afternoon tiredness is kicking in. So I'll keep my remarks short, and then after like 22 minutes or so, we can actually switch to a Q&A session, which I guess will make it a bit more interesting. And you can ask any questions you have on R2P in Venezuela or Latin America, since this is the only session on Latin America that you're gonna have. So I'll get started right away. I'm sure and confident that all of the previous speakers have said this about their sessions, but I am really happy that we get to discuss R2P in Venezuela because I think it's such an interesting conversation in the context of the responsibility to protect. Some of you may have been aware of a lot of conversations that have been happening in different fora on, invoking, activating, implementing the responsibility to protect in Venezuela. So today, I really want to make it all about, clarifying why are we talking about R2P in the case of Venezuela? What does it mean? How has it been implemented? How can it be implemented? And how should it be understood? Last point of housekeeping, I guess I'll say, is I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read the article or listen to the podcast that was shared ahead of the lecture. I'll be very honest in saying that I read about 20% of things that I'm supposed to read. So if you haven't, I feel you. And I will just start with a little bit of background for those of you who are new to the conversation on Venezuela specifically. So I really want to start with the why. Why is Venezuela a situation where we actually talk about the responsibility to protect? And at the very beginning, it's important for me to emphasize that Venezuela today, as you may be aware of, is really facing a multidimensional crisis that is affecting all aspects of life. The country is going through an unprecedented humanitarian, economic, political, and human rights crisis, which started a long time ago, but started to significantly deteriorate in around 2014. You will know that large parts of the healthcare system have collapsed, hyperinflation skyrocketed. You will also know that the country is facing a protracted political crisis with the president, Nicolás Maduro, and his government, and then Juan Guaidó and the very fractured and divided opposition on the other hand. You may also recall that Juan Guaidó, who at some point in 2019, 2020, when he was the president of the then opposition-led National Assembly, was actually recognized as caretaker president by around 60 governments from around the world. So I'm saying all of this because of this multidimensional crisis. Oftentimes when we hear about, R2P is needed in Venezuela, or we need to implement or invoke R2P in Venezuela, references are actually made to all of these different crises, insecurity, humanitarian disaster, political deadlock. And I think that's important. That's an important place to start, because that's already where a lot of misunderstandings are coming from. Because when we talk about R2P in Venezuela, then yes, absolutely, we need to have a look at the complex emergency as it is. to understand the context. But as you know, R2P covers a very particular set of crimes and violations and abuses, atrocity crimes. So the conversation of R2P in Venezuela is not necessarily about the broader crisis. It's not necessarily looking at all the human rights violations and abuses. It's looking specifically at what has facilitated and what continues to facilitate the commission of atrocity crimes. What we know today, and this is including thanks to official UN investigations, is that since at least 2014, when mass protests against the Maduro government erupted and demonstrators demanded an end to hyperinflation, insecurity, lack of essential services, various patterns and state policies, because of their widespread and systematic nature, may actually amount to crimes against humanity. So what this means is that since at least 2014, the government and state agents, so this includes security and intelligence forces, have deliberately and systematically committed widespread torture, sexual and gender-based violence, arbitrary detention, and enforced disappearances in attempts to silence political dissent, so largely for political motives, and targeting anyone perceived as against the Maduro government. We also know that at the same time and under a different context, which is fighting crime, state agents, including the so-called Special Action Forces, or FIs, you may have heard of them, have allegedly perpetrated thousands, tens of thousands of extrajudicial killings, in particular in low-income neighborhoods. And all of this has taken place amidst a very gradual and long-term breakdown of democratic institutions and the rule of law. And this includes an erosion of judicial independence in Venezuela over many, many years and going back much longer than 2014. Now, in September 2020, a Human Rights Council mandated fact-finding mission on Venezuela warned that these patterns, which I just outlined, may actually, they do constitute a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population. They were ordered and authorized at the highest level of government. So we're looking at presidential ministerial leadership to crush political dissent, to inflict fear, social control, and to fight crime. And that these may in fact amount to crimes against humanity. We also had, as Karen mentioned, we had a team of experts at the Organization of American States, OAS, as well as the then chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, coming to similar conclusions in the past years. So while we know today what has enabled the commission of atrocity crimes in the past, so impunity, lack of independent judiciary, lack of democratic institutions, crackdown on civil society, free speech, persecution of political opponents. We also know all of the conditions and the factors which remain in place today in Venezuela, and which means that these patterns actually continue. So the conversation around R2P in Venezuela really is about two things. On the one hand, it's about the need for accountability and justice for past atrocity crimes, but at the same time, it's about looking at what keeps enabling these crimes to continue and how we can prevent them from continuing. How can we ensure non-recurrence? So this is really the conversation about R2P in Venezuela and why we talk about the responsibility to protect in this setting. And so I want to kind of go to the next kind of conversation, which is what has been done so far in terms of upholding, implementing R2P. And what is interesting with regards to Venezuela is that over the past years, we have actually seen a large number of measures that were taken as part of the R2P toolbox in responding to the crisis or trying to respond to the crisis. Some of them more effective than others, obviously. But I want to give a couple of concrete examples of how states and the wider international community have upheld R2P. Targeted sanctions is a good example. We have seen targeted sanctions against individual alleged perpetrators, including high-level government officials, the president and his inner circle, authorized by the EU, by the US, Canada, regional countries, which is an important R2P measure. We have also seen back in 2018 a referral by 6 regional states of the situation of Venezuela to the International Criminal Court. We have seen a very active Human Rights Council adopting resolutions, including one which established the independent fact-finding mission on Venezuela, which I just mentioned before. We also see mediation efforts by Norway and other governments, which are actually currently taking place as well. We have seen the OAS play a very active role in Venezuela, adopting a number of resolutions over the past year. But we have also seen decisions and conversations by the US, Colombia, on granting temporary protection status for Venezuelan refugees. So all of these measures, some of them are political, others are diplomatic, economic, humanitarian, all of them are part of upholding R2P. And I think that the case of Venezuela shows you really well that the R2P action toolbox is much larger than Pillar 3 coercive measures or a focus on the Security Council. There are many other things that can be done and should be done. I want to bring this to kind of the next part of the conversation, which is the key stakeholders in implementing R2P. And I've teased this already, but I want to focus on three specifically. And I'll start with the Human Rights Council. I'm a bit biased because I'm based in Geneva and I focus on the Human Rights Council, but I really believe that the Council, with regards to Venezuela, but also with regards to a couple of other country situations where we see atrocity crimes taking place, has actually been much more effective than the Security Council. In the case of Venezuela, the Human Rights Council has played really an essential role in responding to the crisis. Back in September 2019, we actually had a group of regional countries who at that time all had a very strong political position against the Maduro government, who decided to actually lead on a resolution at the Human Rights Council, which established a fact-finding mission on Venezuela. I mentioned that before. I'll call it the FFM from now on because it's shorter. But basically, such an FFM, it's an independent investigative body which is mandated to document certain violations and abuses and to provide recommendations for accountability and justice. And I should really emphasize here that establishing a fact-finding mission or any other kind of investigative body, that's a very strong step that the Human Rights Council can take. And so you can imagine that this involved significant political will by a large number of states, either to lead on this decision, or to even just support it and vote in favor. And it was then this very FFM, which a year after it was established in September 2020, actually came out with their report warning that the patterns of violations and abuses may in fact amount to crimes against humanity. So there's two important elements about the Human Rights Council as a key stakeholder. One, the Human Rights Council as a political body itself. This is a key stakeholder because it can make decisions and it can adopt resolutions responding to situations where we see a risk or ongoing atrocities. At the same time, the fact-finding mission as an outcome of that decision, as a technical independent investigation, is a key stakeholder as well, and is essential for helping us to understand the root causes of crimes against humanity in Venezuela, but also to contribute to accountability for perpetrators through the recommendations that it gives. The second key stakeholder that I want to mention is the International Criminal Court. And some of you who are following the situation in Venezuela may know that the situation has been under preliminary examination since 2018. We also had the previous chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, announcing at the end of her term at the end of her mandate in mid-June 2021 that she concluded the preliminary examination. So right now, everyone is more or less waiting on the new prosecutor, Karim Khan, to announce the opening of a formal investigation, which we're very much hoping will be the case. I think that there's two important elements here about the International Criminal Court as a key mechanism in upholding R2P with regards to Venezuela. The first one is obviously that of accountability. You know, the ICC as a judicial body may actually hold perpetrators to account. And therefore, it's essential in upholding R2P through justice and accountability because Venezuela's judiciary is failing to investigate or prosecute any of the perpetrators. But there's an interesting second element to it as well, to the ICC, which is that of a possible deterrent effect. Perpetrators, including senior high-level government officials, know that they're being watched. And so perhaps more than being scared of ever standing trial in The Hague, which we know takes a very long time and may not be the case for many, many perpetrators. But in addition to that, being under the scrutiny of the International Criminal Court actually makes the life of perpetrators very uncomfortable for most places outside of Venezuela. So there's two elements here which make the ICC important for R2P. The last key stakeholder that I want to mention is, I guess it's the most obvious one. It's states. I mean, R2P is a state responsibility. It's Venezuela's responsibility, but it's also that of the wider international community. And UN member states from the region, but also from all around the world, really play a key role in responding to the crisis and upholding R2P. On the one hand, bilaterally, but also, and again, Karen has mentioned this, through regional organizations, through their membership in certain groups. In the case of Venezuela, we have seen different groups of countries being formed in the past years, the Lima Group, the International Contact Group, all of them trying to respond to the crisis. EU, OAS are very engaged. So states really are essential stakeholders here. And what's interesting, again, with regards to Venezuela compared to other atrocity situations where states, quite frankly, prefer to look away oftentimes, Venezuela does show us how much engagement by states there can be if there is political will. We are seeing many, many states from the region and from the wider international community engaged in mediation, authorizing sanctions, establishing investigative bodies. So all of that being said, I think I've been talking for 10 or 15 minutes now about, this is R2P and this is what has been done and everyone is so important. And some of you may now think, well, if that's all the case, that's great, but why has the situation in Venezuela not improved? Why is the crisis continuing? Why do we see potential crimes against humanity continuing today? And if you're thinking that right now, I just want to tell you, you really have a point. So I want to take the last couple of minutes to say, where do we go from here? How can we uphold R2P? How can we try and respond to the crisis and prevent the crimes against humanity from continuing? I want to go back to the ICC in answering that question. First of all, the ICC is essential for accountability, absolutely. But even if an investigation is authorized, which we're very much hoping will be the case, we all know that these cases take a very long time to prepare and to, to start off, right? So it's really important to stress here that in addition to the International Criminal Court, in addition to these international justice mechanisms, every state and every government should actually consider to take legal action in accordance with their domestic laws to contribute to accountability for perpetrators in Venezuela. So any state can actually and should explore avenues for justice, including through universal jurisdiction. Relying on the ICC here really isn't enough. And this brings me to my second point, which is the fact-finding mission. The FFM has a very unique mandate to contribute to justice and accountability, and their investigations, their reporting is essential for ICC proceedings, but also for any potential judicial proceedings in a third state. Yes. But in addition to that, that information by the FFM, it shouldn't just be used in The Hague or in a courtroom. The international community, so UN member states, should actually utilize this information to intensify pressure on the government to commit to broader system-wide reform. So what I'm trying to say here is that governments should utilize the findings by the fact-finding mission to guide their policy decisions on any long-term engagement with Venezuela through the UN system and beyond. And what do I mean by that? And I'll give 3 concrete examples. First, any technical assistance or capacity building which is provided by other states to Venezuela should be guided by the recommendations made by the fact-finding mission, because the fact-finding mission tells you exactly where the structural risk factors for crimes against humanity lie in the country, what needs to be reformed in order to prevent their recurrence. So the info by the FFM should actually be used as a tool of prevention. in addition to a tool of accountability. The second point is that Venezuela's Universal Periodic Review is actually coming up in January 2021. So states will have a very concrete opportunity to ask the delegation of Venezuela what happened to the recommendations by the fact-finding mission and why they were not implemented. And states should also, when they give recommendations to the government of Venezuela during that review, they should base these recommendations on the findings by the fact-finding mission to really focus on the prevention of atrocity crimes. And then the third point, and then I'll stop here. I mentioned before that as we speak, we have the Maduro government and representatives of the opposition engaged in political negotiations. These negotiations are actually supported by a large number of states, and some of them are actively participating. Now, key states in this negotiation process, which is taking place at the moment, they actually have an important role to play in getting the Maduro government to commit to taking basic steps to restore human rights and address the recommendations by the fact-finding mission. So overhauling the judiciary, ensuring accountability, dismantling state agents who have been accused of potential crimes against humanity. Committing to human rights reform should be the basis for these political negotiations, and states who are participating and who have a very active and influential role in this process should make this a starting point. Now, I will end here and I'll open for Q&A, but I just want to end by saying that everything I've just said in terms of how R2P applies to Venezuela, I think it brings me back, it always brings me back to the main point or the main message that I kind of want to bring across, which is that R2P is a political commitment, and you all know it's not a magic bullet. It's not something that can be activated or implemented and will lead to imminent changes, at least not in the case of Venezuela. In the case of Venezuela, as all of the examples that I gave you, I think it shows that it will really need long-term engagement, which is focused on maximum pressure on the government to commit to system-wide reform, ensuring accountability, including for international justice, but also to really adopt a forward-looking approach in terms of prevention and to use all of the information that we have, thanks to the fact-finding mission and others, to understand what has facilitated the commission of crimes against humanity in the past and what needs to be done to prevent their recurrence. And this will take time, but most importantly, this will actually take political will by the international community and by states to do something with the information that we have at our hands.